Hello, hello, people. Back again. How do YouTubers do it? Hey guys, back again with your favorite philosopher, not Aristotle, but Alex and Luca. Yeah, thanks for joining us. This is episode 2, officially or unofficially, but this is episode 1 of us actually getting into the book because the first episode that you can see, we'll have it on screen right now. You can see it was more just a laying of the foundation and an intro to ourselves as people and also to the thinker, philosopher, Aristotle, the polymath, the great visionary, and to the book. I would say his masterpiece, I would say his masterpiece, one of his many treatises. So yeah, today we'll get more into it. We'll get into the first book officially. It's called Alpha. He's just kind of going by Greek terminology. So this would be book 1, and it has many chapters, and we kind of tentatively decided beforehand that we'll get through as much as we can, and we won't really rush to finish off the book. There's 10 chapters in this book, or 8 maybe, and we'll get through as many as we can. And when we feel like it's just a natural culmination point, we'll end this and we'll continue off next time. So it is a pretty heavy, meaty part of the book right at the start. I think he wrote this in a lot of excitement. So we'll try and do that justice, and yeah, we'll see how we go. But yeah, we also did want to have a quick recap of last episode. So firstly, welcome back, Alex. Any opening thoughts? And then if you want to just do a quick summary of your thoughts of our last conversation.
Thanks, Luca. Looking very healthy and reconciled today. It's great to be back. Great to be sharing the space with you again. And I'm still have a kind of a nervousness and excitement for continuing the series, getting into the real meat of Aristotle's analysis and the kind of crafting of his concepts, as is the case in the metaphysics. So yeah, excited for this. I'm a believer in the recap in these series. I think it's a helpful way to build coherence between ourselves as interlocutors, but also for the audience, and just having a nice flow on and synthesis from what we talked about in the last episode. So yeah, like I've listened to it a couple times back and thought it was a great episode. You know, we got into our own personal introductions to philosophy. And for me, how I have a firm conviction that philosophy is a way of life. It's something that you live through, not something that you just merely study. And yeah, there's also a real connection between almost spirituality and philosophy, where spirituality could be seen as the way that philosophy is brought into your life, how its value is cashed out in the different decisions that you make, and how connected and related you are to things. We also went into the context of Aristotle, what it was like to be doing philosophy 2,500 years ago, with limited paper, and a lot of constraints on what you were doing. But we also appreciated that as part of Aristotle's context, he too was embodying philosophy. It was a way of life. It was tied in with different practices, different exercises, physical and observational, that all tied into it. So in an active philosophy. We also talked about philosophy as physiology, which again is linking these idea of that embodied and bottom-up approach to philosophy, where it's not from the armchair, it's from your real contact with the world, finding out where you're wrong, where your cognition or your actions are misguided, and getting some real feedback from that. So from the bottom up, and even for me, as I listen to a lot of dialogues and a lot of my philosophy on runs, like it really is from the bottom up, bones and all, where yeah, it just, and for me, that's a way of it just having a great entry point into my physiology and the fullness of my worldview. Like when I'm on a run, when I'm like really active and out there, that for me is like a great place for philosophy to land. And I also
Mm,
felt when we touched on the subject of the metaphysics, we had kind of discussed how it really at the heart has this complexity. It has this contradiction of being, on the one hand, the only thing really worthwhile and the natural end of the pursuit of philosophy, but also completely undoable, something that has substance only because we're like holding the knot that we've tied, but when we let it go, like it it may come undone. Um, and I think that is actually part of the contradiction as to why it's got that allure, why we're drawn to it, why it's beyond our grasp to understand that, requires a form of self-transcendence to try and come to understand that. Yeah, and I thought one of the last things, which I'll say in summary, was, yeah, how this is an endeavor to make the unconscious conscious and to re-find Aristotle in the zeitgeist and the psyche and in the practice of philosophy, and to, yeah, shine some light onto the deep impact he's had culturally and how he's been absorbed and been forgotten, but hey, where is it still through and through today? How are we still abiding by Aristotle's philosophy itself and method?
mm. Yeah, I think a great jumping off and foundational point that launched us doing this at all in the first place was our shared interest and agreement on the fact that at the base of all of this lies a very paramount paradox, which is, and this was touched upon in the introduction to the metaphysics as well, at least in the version I'm reading with the translator, who says that philosophy is supremely useless and supremely elevating. And I think he's likening philosophy, or he's kind of just putting the whole of metaphysics as a interchangeable term with philosophy here, because we did touch on this last time, but metaphysics was seen as the pinnacle of all speculative and contemplative thought at the time of writing. So I do want to acknowledge that, yeah. And also just at a personal level, I keep seeing the same pattern detected as I go about my day, and the sense impressions I encounter and that impress most unto me are that of paradoxes higher or lower. And at the root of philosophy lies this ability to hold the knot that appears to be a knot that is a knot, but is not a knot, because the minute you let it go, it's actually just going to come undone. So I think we both share a kind of dewy-eyed moon cat, wonder that lies at the bottom of philosophy. And Aristotle talks about straight away at the opening of this book as well about how the precondition to engage at all with the world of thought is this sense of awe and wonder. And we'll likely get into that. But just to finish off the recap, yeah, I think we did a good job in terms of weaving in and out of the historical context, the man behind the story, and the text, some of the concepts themselves and how we relate to them. And then, yeah, philosophy is physiology, the state that you're in, because we agree, me and you, wholeheartedly, that something is most informative when it's more than informative and actually transformative. Informative is like the first step to transformation. So I think for that to be the case, we do have to engage with it and approach it almost skittishly on purpose, and that's the proper requisite to start metaphysics. So yeah, I really enjoyed our last conversation. I feel like already in the recap we've got a few sound bites ready for this one. So yeah, any closing thoughts or my closing thoughts before we get into Alpha?
I just really appreciate your great ability for articulation and, yeah, bringing all that together. It's just it's great to listen to. One of the concluding thoughts I had was, um, yeah, I was looking at some of the sort of metaphysics of Forrest Landry, who's a contemporary, but you could liken to a modern Aristotle in terms of being a polymath, religiously devoted to his study and um, curiosity and wonder about the life. And again, like he also points to that paradox in metaphysics. There's a great quote of his: "There's no objectivity that does not end in subjectivity. There's no subjectivity that does not end in objectivity." So just really reconciling those polarities that we have in our experience, and when we look out into the world, how we can kind of always find ourselves looking back at us, or yeah, always just find the nature within us. There's a continuum there that's deep and profound and doesn't like to be captured in words.
Yeah,
And yet here we are.
the first line of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil is, "Suppose truth is a woman, what then?" You know, perennially elusive. And something that someone you brought up last time, soon to be friend of the show, John Viveki, talks about his neologism, the transjective, right, um, as a way of synthesizing what emanates and emerges and collides in the middle somehow.
Yeah, definitely.
And then, yeah, the one other part I would just add on to the recap is that, yeah, again, the rootedness of the historical context of the time of writing. It's worth noting again that hermeneutics as a field is quite new, you know, like this fixation we have of psychology and language and the cognizing subject as the thing to study rather than the thing that the subject is studying, is a new fascination for us. It's really post Descartes. I mean, retrospectively, we say that maybe the times are, you know, not exactly that, but yeah, it's only a fascination of the last 400, 500, 600 years that we've worried about the person making the judgment rather than the nature of reality itself. And the fact that our senses deceive, distort, contort is something Heraclitus talks about and, you know, bases his philosophy off of. But I guess it's made more explicit in recent times is what I'm trying to say. So for Aristotle, this, yeah, again, it is the epitome of any study, any thought. And I just wanted to kind of preface that again, that if he knew that, you know, 15 or 2000 years later we'll be so obsessed with the guy making the call, I think he would have like premeditated that and focused on that instead. But at the time of writing, this was the most he could do, and so he did that. Yeah, I don't know why I'm defending him as if someone's attacking him, but yeah, I guess one thing we are attempting to do here is to bring him, you know, make a small splash in the public consciousness as far as his reputation is concerned, because I do think he should be treated with a revived interest as we have with thinkers like Foucault and Deleuze, who I really like, and even Wittgenstein and Heidegger. Really, like 19th and 20th century thinkers have undergone some sort of downgoing and then revival, and I'd love to do that with some of the more classic thinkers as well, and find out ways in which to, you know, personalize his kind of panoply and pantheon of work and modernize, personalize it, and then immediately implement it as well, because it's just a gold mine of insights. And I guess the only book that has immediately become like, you know, useful and actionable is his Nicomachean Ethics, named famously after his father, I think. But yeah, I think there's just a litany of insights that we can harvest from physics categories, and most profoundly this one, metaphysics. So that's also just a part of the recap, is that we are attempting to uphold his reputation and even hopefully take it further, depending on how the series goes.
Love it.
And then, yeah, to kickstart this conversation, I was thinking we could start with the role of the philosopher. We kind of touched on it already, but in Alpha 1 and 2, Aristotle does talk about, you know, what are the conditions under which philosophy can be done. How do we know that we're doing philosophy? And he's very reverential of the study. You know, like a lot of thinkers in his time, he almost conflates, you could say, if you're being cynical, that philosophy is straight up theology. You know, it's so eminent, it's so the word of the gods, as it were, and access to true reality that's behind the veil, that there is, you know, negligible difference. So yeah, I guess to open up the conversation to just, you know, thoughts and how we can get into this, what comes to mind when you think of the philosopher engaging in philosophy? What is his role? Does he have a duty? Is there a set of preconditions he has to meet to step into the battlefield, as it were? And is there a state? Because we obviously spoke about physiology and the difference in nervous system states. And, you know, like if you were to rewire your circuitry a little bit, the same, it's almost like one variable being changed has an outlandishly different outcome. So, yeah, what do you make of all this?
I think a lot of what, a lot of what's layered there is what has been like deeply informing our discussion from the last episode and the start of this. And I think there's just a character of embodying and meaning the words that you speak that I would argue is essential for a philosopher. It's essential to be grounded in, yeah, in your perception, in your subjectivity, and acknowledging that place. Like, wouldn't you say, Luca, that it almost harkens back to that great maxim of to know thyself is, is inscribed over the door of the academy, that is what is being asked of us in philosophy as a prerequisite. Before you enter the academy, before you walk through the gates, to know thyself is there in writing. And I'm kind of realizing the symbolism of that as as I say it, but I think there's something true in the profound transformation that's required of someone as they enter in and do philosophy, which is, essentially a practice of self-transcendence and coming to think your, for Hegel, think your historicity, and for Aristotle, like, still think of the ultimacy, which the ultimacy is our historicity localized to a specific time.
Yeah, as Dostoevsky says, man is not historical being. Man is not cattle, he is historical being. And for you to be placing yourself at a level of metacognition in between your ancestors and posterity is a precondition for sure. And to know yourself is to see yourself. And one of the first things Aristotle talks about in the first part of Alpha 1 is the importance of sight and the primacy of sight of the five in all of the five senses, and that being something that separates us as well. You know, so much of his history is preoccupied with what actually separates man from animal, and why do we privilege ourselves? And animals grazing on grass, as it were, they have sight, but they view cognition differently. They're different subjects. They have limitations we don't have. At least we like to tell ourselves. So yeah, I agree with to know yourself is to truly see yourself, and there's no place in philosophy for disingenuousness, and all you can do is limit that in yourself and hope. And again, there's that, teetering on the edge. You're at a cliffhanger every step of the engagement. If you know for sure you know yourself, then you've already lost. So it's like it's just one step forward, 1.5 steps back, but then like half a step forward, so you're back to equilibrium. So you've made it nowhere, but you've had really quite a voyage.
One step forward, one inverted step backward. Such is the way of deepening that contradiction and realizing the greater depths and substance that's revealed. Because it's right, it's know yourself, but Socrates was the philosopher that knew that he didn't know, who didn't think he was wise. He had that same almost ambivalence towards it, but really just a complex attitude towards wisdom. And yeah, you see that playing out in some of the philosophical rhetoric that we hear, but you also see it playing out in, okay, what's being produced, what have they done, which was actually very productive and made a lot of progress. So again, the inverted step backwards, it's not to reconcile.
No, it's to take stock. It's to authentically take stock and reconcile rather than to use a 2020s term, humble brag. When Socrates says, I know that I know nothing, or a version of that, he's not trying to get his surrounding milieu to say, but you are smart, Socrates. That does happen, but I don't think that's what his intention is.
It's almost that sincere irony as well, which is kind of this reflecting of like some of the structure of feeling that is still lingering today and that we're always rediscovering in some way, like how Socratic irony is being taken up in some ways today through various forms of irony, but much different, but still having that same effect of pointing to one thing, but ultimately trying to reveal a deeper attitude of care or reverence that's kind of hidden by it in some way, because you can't just state reverentially what you are. You can't expose your value like that in some ways, and you can do it in a more powerful way to point to the opposite of that value through the irony, and therefore like determine and define actually the place that you care about. And I think
just to quickly add on that, sorry, it's worth noting how much of our brain circuitry is oriented around, or our perception as a subset of our brain circuitry is wired to do with recognition through contrast and a foregrounding of that which is explicitly not the background. So I think that pays homage to what you're talking about as well.
And maybe that's a first cause and principle that runs so deep, and knowledge is wisdom is the knowledge of certain kinds of principles. Like that's the definition Aristotle would give, and something that's I've been wrestling with, and that's been coloring my thinking for the last while. And it's in moments like that where I can sort of see more of the truth and meaning to that kind of statement, because otherwise wisdom as the knowledge of first causes and principles seems a little bit dry and a little bit unable to capture the full depth of what something like wisdom is. But so let's as well step into the text. Like one thing that was coming to mind as we were discussing this, like for Aristotle, there was a big emphasis on essence, on the essence of a person. And I've come to find that something that is really helpful in understanding Aristotle is how he does have that, and this is his historicity, how he has that deep belief that there is something that differentiates humans from the rest of the world and from the rest of life, the animal kingdom. And the thing that distinguishes us is this receptivity to and capacity of the logos to give an account of things, to be rational. And like really the mind was a big thing for Aristotle. And so as we go forward in a lot of what we see and talk about in him, I think is going to be, and it is for me at least at this stage, revolving around that idea of Aristotle really wanting to preserve and care for and be in right relation to that aspect of the human which made us who we are, which gave us that almost higher cognitive faculty, but for Aristotle gave us access to like the mind as such, that we participated in some sense in nous, in the mind. And so we see that kind of pervading his philosophy, for example, in his definition of wisdom, where it's a kind of knowledge of first principles and causes, where it's that mental understanding and grasping of such realities.
Yeah, and would you say that that's typical of the thought of his time, to give privilege to that definition or style of wisdom?
There's a lot of similarities around, and one of the things that he does early in this first book in the Metaphysics is examine the historicity of thought that's been before him. but he does such a terrible job. He calls Heraclitus and Parmenides, like he's calling these people materialists and, just not giving a good account of their work. But you do see through that analysis and through um, his teacher Plato, that kind of development is being reached, but it's not being fully realized and articulated comprehensively. Um, One of the ways he describes some of these philosophers who are talking before him is, as boxers where sometimes they'll land a good punch or say something that really strikes true, like they're really able to think and discover one of the causes, one of the four causes, like, and but he's saying if you read their other things, like it's quite incomprehensible. It's not swift. It doesn't all match up. So although they can land a lucky punch, although they can speak of mind and of causes, they're not really able to synthesize it and form a coherent philosophy around it.
Yeah, what differentiates a true philosopher is the ability to possess an account, right? Some sort of access to the source code. And Aristotle does diminish his predecessors a lot, saying they accidentally hit the mark sometimes, and I'll acknowledge that, and here's where they did that. But for it to be an ongoing engagement in a study that's worthwhile and valuable, they haven't done that. And here's how you should do that. And yeah, this is, I would say, there's an elitism, obviously present in every Greek philosopher. That's nature of the time they're writing in, and also desirable, I would argue, in a philosopher as a starting point. What is common is not rare, and what is not rare is not of value. And it's just this kind of another contradiction or another paradox that you just need to employ straight away and just get on with. It's like, yeah, this is not for everyone. There's a inherent anti-egalitarianism present and rampant running through. But where I saw this most is when he says, again, in classic philosopher fashion, he emphasizes the importance of abstraction. And, when we were talking about the role of the philosopher and the preconditions to engage, we talked about just this curiosity and sense of wonder that lies at the bottom of it. But he does say that designers are afforded more prestige than craftsmen. And that's quite interesting. And I think innately, the more elitist you are, the more you're likely to just instinctively agree with that. There's like a hierarchy, and at the bottom are the people that are the many. And generally, when we think of a hierarchy as well, you close your eyes and you say the word, you think of a pyramid. But why is that the case? Why is it that the top is, they're breathing more rarefied air? I don't know why we just instinctively view it that way. Is this a natural principle ingrained in us, or is this through conditioning? But yeah, I see that a lot in Aristotle. And the person who's obsessed with the acquisition of wisdom is the one who's got his sole focus on the top of that pyramid, and the top of that pyramid would be the underlying causes of what gives rise to the foundation of that pyramid. And in the case of the craftsman, the person engaged in direct sense experience is not doing that. The person engaged in the design knows how to replicate what the theory is. And I think Aristotle says somewhere in Alpha 2, maybe, that replicability is a key part, or teachability is a key part of actually having knowledge and skill. It is important that you're able to teach, and it's almost an inversion of the age-old those who don't know, or those who can't do teach. It's almost the opposite of that. Only those who know can teach, and teaching is of supreme importance and value. And he's also very explicit about how there's a woo-wah like new ageness to things that just about elude our grasp or evade our grasp. Things that elude us are more tempting, and there's like a seductive, I really want to get to it nature. And the person who's entranced by such a desire and a yearning is actually in a healthy state, according to Aristotle, I would argue, because, which is strange to me. Like, I completely disagree with that. I think the person who's always seeking and dying for more is probably not the one you would typically posit to be the healthy soul. But for Aristotle, the one who has this undying sense of wonder across all domains is the philosopher, and the philosopher is good.
Yeah. Thanks for opening us up to so much and opening listeners up to a lot there, because yeah, you trawl through and and explore and weave so many great conceptions of distinctions Aristotle makes between designers and craftsmen, or the different characteristics of the wise, and how kind of being able to teach that is one of the hallmarks of a wise person.
And
And
I'll
I'd
just
love to
add
get
one other thing. Sorry, I view this as probably the prime precipitation of the 2,000-year obsession that was to come with true causes and the reality that lies behind the veneer. Famously with Kant and Hegel's answer to Kant, and just this undying thirst for figuring out what is and why what is isn't what we see. And I think Aristotle was the first to kind of, after Plato, I suppose, but Plato
Mm,
wasn't, he didn't write in one place about the forms, and we'll talk about that more in the next episode. But this seems to me the first full-on dissertation, as it were, into reality being somehow hidden from us.
yeah.
And I both grasp it intuitively, and I also don't. It's one of those things that, why does my phenomenology admit of something that isn't the case? It's a bit like the free will discussion and argument. Why does it feel like I keep saying I, and I'm the prime motive, and something deep within me motivates my brain to tell my arm to do something, and that's what the experience, the felt sense is like. But when I sit down at a desk and I think, no argument leads me to me thinking I have free will. So why would there be this innate contradiction? And why does God do this to me? Why is it laid out this way? Why is the chessboard organized in such a way? Is it just for it to feel and be tantalizing? Because if so, then it's succeeding.
Yeah, and I think of how Plato has articulated that as well, but has done so in a story, right? In the allegory of the cave. And yeah, also is, yeah, in one sense, to first apprehend a certain kind of knowledge, like it passes through in that mythopoetic sense, and then maybe it comes to Aristotle, and it's more of a time where he can then reify it, clarify it, and articulate it as principles and in a scientific way, rather than having to be through that story form, where people in the cave have to actually, they're just seeing shadows, and actually there is um, a real transcendent reality that the forms participate in, that the good is at the center of, and yeah, it's beyond just mere sense perception. I think as well, like they had Plato and Aristotle had that antagonism to the sensory, like, to sense perception as a form of knowledge, because it was shared by animals and other beings, and it's something that's so conditioned and determined by the world and our specific place and time that we're here. Um, and what they were concerned with was like, okay, what's actually unchanging in that? What is more stable across time? And what's the source of our ability to apprehend things that seem to go beyond the here and now, and what we can make sense of with our perceptions, like free will? What gives us that tendency and capacity to have higher forms of knowledge that we can seek out and find? And it almost goes back a little bit to, like, in that context, Luca, how would you make of the opening line of the work of all, was it all men by nature desire to know?
Mm.
Um, how do you reach that reality and then are concerned with it and question it, and why does it trouble you so much? Um, do you feel like that encapsulation of that innate desire to understand your place, and just to prefer sight rather than not sight, without any utilitarian means for seeing. Does that resonate with you as Aristotle's opening statement, and where are your own like antagonisms with that idea, or where does it not seem to bear truth value?
I view Socrates' maxim of all I know is that I know nothing as actually being too assumptive. Even that is just too assumptive for me. You cannot possibly know that you know nothing. And I think the bedrock, as it were, of epistemics is more absent in my thought of it than perhaps even Descartes might have worried about, you know? And well, I guess I also think knowledge is impossible as a starting point. I don't know, like I'm enjoying this, I'm loving this conversation, but I'm not doing it to go from A to B because I don't even know what A is. There's no possible B, like we were alluding to earlier about recognition through contrast. For you to get somewhere, you have to leave somewhere else. And I don't think I could accurately give an account of where I am at any one given stage, fractally across all domains of life. I don't just mean obviously mental state, you know, natural state, region. I mean across as a synthesis of all of that. So the inability to actually give an account makes me think that, or makes me believe that I guess it kind of goes back to a distrust of the senses as well. Recently, I've really been studying brain science more in language, and the level of language traps that are ubiquitous in daily life and just present, you know, endlessly and seemingly, you know, they're sitting there as tricksters waiting to deceive us has thrown me off a little bit. And so I'm just naturally a bit more cynical to the idea of the attaining of knowledge. And maybe there's a deep rooted desire to know, but I think that if I was going to postulate that that man has a deep rooted desire, it wouldn't be for knowledge. It would be for something more to do with the affects. And I wouldn't put knowledge as a category within the affects or the pathic layer. It might be something like ameliorating suffering, because I wouldn't immediately say that the thing that we naturally innately most want is something that is even good for us. Like that's not a given conclusion to me, you know. I think there's so many things that contort our reality that the thing that we most want could be death, for example, which is the case and by, you know, in accordance or in concordance with a lot of philosophies. So including my cultural philosophy about the supreme goal might be moksha or some sort of enlightenment, and for that you would have to be disembodied. So I don't know why you'd want that, but for those that want that, you know, more power to you. But yeah, I don't see some sort of, when we talk about the logos, I don't see it being a benevolent ordering principle. I see it being a very much indifferent thing that treats us like how God treats Job. We are here not even as playthings, perhaps. We're here and God's there and we're living our lives concurrently, you know, entirely parallel, disaffected, dispassionate to each other. And so when I think of, to actually answer your question and go back to what you asked about all men by nature desiring to know, first of all, I would say that the root desire that all men have is different to one another. There's no universal like 0, or something akin to a pneuma that we share. I would firmly disagree with that. It's a romantic notion to picturize humanity as one, but I think my own metaphysics pays more credit to different centers of reality, each with an actual existence that you cannot know, that you cannot through negation bring into yourself as a subset of yourself and thereby attain higher consciousness. Because I think I reject some certain metaphysical principles that Aristotle might have held, that other philosophers might have held. I don't even know how to disentangle the quote that Aristotle starts this book with. And almost nothing resonates in what he's saying to me, just in that one line.
Yeah. And there's such a vastness that I'm hearing about. Yeah, yeah, almost like the different constellations that are alive for you, and yeah, really difficult to contend with and think through, because it does branch out, and it, like, I can almost say, like, just, with that answer, it certainly seems like it's a very kind of animating area for you, and like, yeah, and animating because of the paradoxes and contradictions in it in some way. Um, but yeah, I can, yeah, also think that, yeah, it doesn't ease, like, people like Aquinas, and even Immanuel Kant and his philosophy kind of stand by it in some capacity, and it makes you wonder why. Like, there's a bit of a, whereas Nietzsche and Hume are kind of like vastly opposed, and yeah, for Nietzsche, it's like, sure, truth and knowledge is great only when it does something for us, only when, like, our deeper desires, and only when truth serves us do we really care about it. And like, there's merit to that when we, just look at history. I'm almost thinking that innately relevance realization is something that we are doing and have to be doing all the time. Like, I wonder if that's a better way to more kind of accurately state what that proto form of knowledge is that Aristotle's talking about, which has which is like laden with affect, and which is not predisposed to be a good thing. Like, you can have relevance realization that is closing you off to the world and contact with reality, for different emotional reasons. Um, it can be reciprocally narrowing, but obviously, in kind of the path that Aristotle, and surrounding himself with community and these like embodied practices was affording, was this reciprocal opening, and that just took place within his own cognition before he could even almost have that conscious influence on it, that it was something which was prior to his own thought, was where like that natural tendency and inclination was. So yeah, maybe that innate there's that innate propulsion for knowledge there, but yeah, it's certainly not as determined and reliable as Aristotle paints it out.
Yeah, it's almost of contingent utility. It's tethered firmly to or coupled with the man who's birthing that into his conscious, and where it's coming from perhaps isn't even the massive iceberg that is the unconscious, but something like a pre-conscious that yeah, acts as like this explosive time zero for this. So yeah, that same question to you though, when you think about all men naturally desiring to know, do you have any resonances or antagonisms with that?
Yeah, it was a little bit in what I said around, I would want to kind of move the terms that we're using and definitions we're giving. Like, when I think about it phenomenologically, I can, like, quite readily understand it, that it, you know, in my later life has been something that is animating and is there, and that there's a natural tendency and drive to learn, to grow, and to understand things, and also to understand things in and of themselves without it needing to be tied to the utility. But I've never seen that as being like, oh, that's the universal way of things. Like, one of the harder things in my last 6 years, um, in my own like personal development, has been how that is not so shared with lots of other people, and like the passion for that innate desire. Um, yeah, and so I've found it to be more of a style, um, and a style of my own philosophy, an approach, a role that I play, but not grounded in a universal principle like Aristotle makes it to be.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about how, the Humes of this world, or even the Foucaults of this world, would say something like, well, yeah, insofar as it serves us, and how that can be deemed to be rather sinister and uh, almost like a diluted, or a cheap way of looking at things. But I think, and it may well be, but I think cheap is the best we've got at the moment, because I don't see how something completely detached from utility would even enter our relevance realization. I don't think we're built for that. So it's almost like, yeah, it's cheap, and what's the alternative? Please give me something expensive, But I feel like if we were on Mars, natural principles wouldn't apply, because the elements of Earth would not be present. And Aristotle does, spend some time talking about previous thinkers' views on nature and the building blocks of reality, and how, for Heraclitus, it might have been fire, just to put it very bluntly and simplistically. But um, how nature is comprised in terms of how we view things, the participatory and contributory role that the literal elements of nature play in that. So yeah, I guess one reason we don't, universally, cosmically, cross-culturally desire to know is because we're on Earth for now. And if we weren't, then I think we wouldn't. And
Yeah.
I also had a question for you on this. This would be a good time to bring in, because Aristotle does talk about Pythagoras a bit, and I was wanting to get your view first, just to like seep into it, is your general take and predisposition towards viewing an account of reality mathematically and having no loose edges. Having an account at all is quite presumptive. In something as self something as conclusive as Kant himself would say, having 12 categories, like, it's a pretty absurd undertaking. And to say that every facet of reality fits into one of these, and if it doesn't, it fits into this mystical 13th category that I've already accounted for the fact that I haven't accounted for. So how do you view having an account of reality so sort of systematically, being a systems thinker in general?
Well, I think for like the particulars of Pythagoras, I'm more, favorable to Aristotle's interpretation. Was how do you get such diverse forms of life and substance and causes and all of these earthly aspects, if you are establishing that from a metaphysics of, yeah, like a system like mathematics. Just there's, yeah, principles and harmonies and relations which Pythagoras finds as fundamental, and creates a philosophy from that. But I think it's a little bit more of the Pythagorean school was more of a mystical approach and orientation to life, and I think there's value in that, and in ways of knowing like real ordering principles to life. But I wouldn't go as, yeah, I also don't see the way in which the kind of that higher form of knowledge can come down and account for, yeah, the, like, maybe it can count for like the beauty and the ordering, but like otherwise the real, like it seems like they are confounding in this symbolic order that they're expressing and articulating in in a rigorous way. But like, yeah, just what about the real that comes in and smacks you and goes beyond the symbolic constructs that you've created? Um, I think they're lacking that level of embodiment in some form. And although they did practice, and um, they weren't just philosophizing from the armchair. They had, I think, they were vegans. They lived in different, vegetarian. They lived in uh, community and practiced, but I think they went too far to try and establish maths and Pythagoreanism as the foundation, and I think Aristotle points it out and is right.
Yeah, I sense with Pythagoras, he goes wayward from where he started, and there's like a serious consecration of what maybe you could say unconsciously was the Apollonian, trying to find a beauty and a simplicity
Yes.
in a mathematic. And there was a quote, there was a book I was reading called Music, the Brain, and Ecstasy on screen right now. I'll just read it out. A geometer's delight, the most important intervals formed by simple frequency ratios. The simpler the ratio, the more consonant the tone. Astronomers would compare the ratios to patterns in the sky. Even like, Coldplay had an album that was really famous a few years ago called Music of the Spheres. And Pythagoras kept on trying to find these micro macrocosm consonances and thinking and telling all his Pythagorean school friends that he did so, and him being like, yeah man, you did. But yeah, so he was even like, one of his he was a phenomenal musician in terms of his understanding of theory and knowledge. And I guess we kind of took on and imported his scale in the Western tradition. It's literally even called the Pythagorean scale, and it's only about 2,000 years later that we realized its limitations. And like the reason he set out to organize pitch intervals the way he did was because there was some sort of musical harmony with the harmony of the heavens. And there was, again, a geometer's delight, as the quote said. It's just perfect if you're a mathematician and everything has to fit into a box. And that is perfect if you're engaging with, or like, have a deep affinity for the Apollonian. And I would say there is a small element, like with the yin yang symbol, there is a small element of the Dionysian lurking in the Apollonian, but it's not the Dionysian flood that will wipe you out. And I see the flood as being this grand unearthing, waiting to rise. And that's one of the, just when we speak purely, fantastically and symbolically and romantically, I view the Dionysian flood as something that could, within 1 second, wipe out Pythagoras' system.
Sorry, what was the last part that you said?
I view the true Dionysian flood, which periodically visits us, as something that could take out a lot of systems thinking. And one system it could take out would be Pythagoras's, this almost sick desire to put everything down to numbers. Like, I know that's not all he's doing, but I think at root, he wants to showcase to the world that the primary constituent in terms of the building blocks of the world is somehow numerical, or can be arithmetized, if not already that in its base form.
Yeah. And there's no doubt of the genius of many of these Greek thinkers, the pre-Socratics. Like, each of them had their own streak of genius, but were like, each of them were also trying to absolutize the understanding of what is. Like, they were trying to learn and discern the first principle, the ultimate cause, and absolutize it in some way. And it's a feature of all human consciousness in some ways, that we need that certainty and almost dogma for something, to provide us with meaning and custom and repetition in this otherwise world of flux. But yeah, from Pythagoras, you almost get that pillar saint vibe, where he did become a kind of cult figure, and how much of his genius was he, just using for, different purposes of status and things like that, is implicit and as deep down as that can get. And
Which is a perennial concern when looking into these thinkers. Again, to bring up my guy Michel Foucault, he said on stage, when asked by some American philosopher, I forget, not Chomsky, someone else, said to him, why don't you speak so lucidly in your texts? I can understand every word you say, and you delineate your ideas very coherently and succinctly. Why don't you do this in your books? And he says, because no one in France would take me seriously or buy my books if I didn't act all woo-wah, And so there's a huge element of that with a lot of thinkers in the Western pantheon, and maybe Pythagoras is just the latest culprit in that.
Yeah, and I feel like this quote we're actually jumping to chapter 8 here, in the Metaphysics. But the causes and the principles which they, the Pythagoreans, mention are, as we said, sufficient to act as steps even up to the higher realms of reality, and are more suited to these than to theories about nature. They do not tell us at all, however, how there can be movement if limit and unlimited and odd and even are the only things assumed, or how without movement and change there can be generation and destruction, or the bodies that move through the heavens can do what they do. And I think it is that critique of, we can get foundational principles, and maybe these are good for giving us knowledge of the heavens, but to explain, the Dionysian aspects, the Apollonian doesn't go all the way. You can't have that rational, enlightened mode of thought to encompass all of the depths and the frenzy in human psychology and in nature, more broadly. And Aristotle as well, I was listening to a lecture on his Poetics, and he actually does arrive at a understanding that it was the tragedies that were the highest form of Greek literature. He had a much greater appreciation for them in their literary form and as stories that did tell the real truths of human nature, that we don't know ourselves, that we don't know our origin, and we're existentially thrown into that condition, where our beings are in question, and we are struggling to come to know ourselves. We're struggling for that task which we can never really quite achieve.
Yeah, I see a serious denigration from Aristotle. Just the first thought that came to mind when you're reading that quote is from people who equate the possession of an account of reality with a simple, mere snapshot of reality right now, in the here and now, not the here, then, and the now, there, and all the different the negative states, basically. And one of the first things in the Metaphysics Aristotle talks about is the lack of an account of purpose. Obviously we'll get into final cause and telos and stuff in later episodes, but just the clear-cut absence in previous thinkers' systems, telling us about movement, duration, and purpose as part of the wider umbrella of change. So it's almost like he says, yeah, you did a good job getting us to the battleground, but you didn't actually win the battle. You got us there, He almost views Pythagoras in that way. And I do, I remember something in the Poetics about this veneration of tragedy, and I immediately thought of Schopenhauer's reverence for music, as a direct copy and representation of the will, not something that deludes, something that cannot possibly delude by theory, by definition, because it's a direct copy. So that came to mind. And then also just, Aristotle is Greek, and he would have a fondness for this idea of autopoiesis. If something is, self-generating, self-producing, then the world itself as a macrocosm that in which we indwell as microcosms would also be just a mirror image of that. And that's why he pays so much attention and care for something, for change in general, how is this system such a well-oiled machine that keeps running? And why is your depiction of this well-oiled machine so flat and flaccid even?
Yeah, and it kind of asks the question of what does Aristotle have in that place? What does, we can talk to, his thoughts about the playwrights before and the philosophers before, but then I'm really curious of where does that leave us? What is Aristotle saying positively about wisdom and the wise person? And we're quite lucky in that he does give us that explanation, and that his work has been preserved to give us that. Whereas, even from the Pythagoreans and Heraclitus and Parmenides. That's like Heraclitus, we only had a small collection of fragments, and from it was sort of enough to understand him as the philosopher of not exactly change, but of paradox. But with Aristotle, we do have his full treatment of wisdom, which he sets out in the Metaphysics as the aim of the metaphysics, essentially. The aim of the metaphysics is wisdom, because wisdom is the knowledge of first causes and principles, and that's what Aristotle's setting up to do. And it's in the first chapter where he's really saying, establishing the target of the text, and yeah, it's kind of setting sights for what we do in the following books and chapters. But as I was going through and learning of Aristotle's definition of wisdom, there was a few challenges, and it was pretty alive for me to then think of, like, okay, in the same way that, okay, Aristotle can commentate so much on others, what does he say? And then it almost draws out the same, okay, I hear and am ingesting so much of Aristotle, but I'm not agreeing with all of it. So then what does that ask of me? So it has been this, and that's the process of the psycho-ontological transformation taking place, which is, a great reflection on this as a practice. But, and I'll put this as a question and then pass it back to you. How do you, and this is going back to what you touched on earlier about almost the design of the pyramid, and how can we say someone's more wise based on how they're interacting and apprehending it? Like the difference between the designer and the craftsman, or the engineer and the laborer, almost for more contemporary terms. How did you feel about Aristotle having that hierarchical ordering and having sense perception as one layer, ordered up to actually collected memory and experience as the next layer, and then actually universalizing it through techne and apprehending the principles within the experiences was actually this ascent of wisdom? How did that as a scheme kind of fare with you?
That's a great question, man. I have a lot to say about that. So I view it, the model that I'd invoke and what really resonates for me is the pre-trans fallacy that Eric Weinstein describes. I think I'll figure it out and put it on screen, but Ken Wilber maybe is his name, talks about and really elucidates upon. And I view techne as the higher form of the laborer. So it's almost like a stage theory, and in this cosmic ladder of life, at the bottom rung, unfortunately, is the laborer who's engaged daily in the sense perception and getting, senses impressed onto him and upon him and feeding it back. And he's very much getting his hands dirty and doing so in a mechanistic, methodological way that I wouldn't reify too much. Above him is the designer, is the craftsman, the engineer, the one who has the vision and can abstract, has this capacity, innate, glorified, deservedly glorified abstraction capacity. But then above him, again, is the laborer. But the laborer now who's engaging in genuine techne, where he's bringing something to life. And so I do see a hierarchy, but at the top and the bottom rung, we have the same guy. And earlier when you were talking about the state that's kind of induced in the reader when you are reading Aristotle, anything by him, I really resonate with that. I don't, read something by him and then take it as a theoretic, figurative truth or a literal truth. I don't even believe in that as a dichotomy. But I think when you're reading something good, whether it's any type of text, be it philosophy, literature, history, theology, it's truly ontogenetic. And so it's breathing life into you and you into something else going forward into posterity. And it's nothing to do with, do I take this as a psychological utility, or did this really happen? Is he saying this? It doesn't matter. The thought process is that it's going to breathe and breed a new ontology for you at a very hyper individualistic level. And God willing, at a more than that level as well. And this is also like, in the ethics is where Aristotle most profoundly talks about the golden mean. And so we can we can be comfortable in ideas like all there is change, and these adages that are seemingly profound and deep because they point us to the underlying chaos that is rampant throughout life. But something else that John Vervaeke says is that saying everything is change is like saying everything is tall. So again, the recognition of contrast. The golden mean here would be to have a system, you not be a systems thinker and absolutize or totalize any one dogma and turn it into dogma, but to have a system such that you can operate, because otherwise you will not even get out of bed if implicitly you don't believe in something, if you don't have a higher truth. So it's not about it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The baby in the bathwater close to you is the golden mean here. So we need to have a truth. I'm not sure how much autonomy we have over selecting that truth, but we are very much in our day-to-day tethered to our truth, and we live that. And that's why so much of forthcoming ontology and metaphysics is shaped by our relationship to that. It's like I don't know if it was Aquinas, but I'll figure it out and put it on screen as well. But love is the highest value and truth is its handmaiden. So there's a coupled relationship between what is most fundamental and valuable and how you get there. And there's a contrast there too. How you get there isn't by imitating the thing or embodying the thing, but it's by being and doing and living something entirely different such that you get there. And I think I answered your question, but that was just a bit of a rant to finish off. Any thoughts on that, sir?
I do have to look pretty hard into that to find where you answered my question, but I'm sure it's there. No, like it was, yeah, I liked what you were saying about, yeah, sure, there's an ascent, there's like different stages, but then, yeah, like it's not just you get to be this artist at the top and then, oh yeah, you're kind of always differentiated or, in a different integral fashion greater than what was before you. You actually come to transcend into the depths of that structure itself, like back into the laborer, back into the humble craftsman in some sense. And I think there's something quite potent there and reflects as well some of the Judeo-Christian tradition where Christ does reintegrate himself completely back into the foundations of that hierarchy. And it's now not just something of the head, it's also connected to the heart in Judeo-Christian in the worldview and in the belief.
Because
And
when you ascend to the top of a hierarchy, it is necessary that you look across to other hierarchies and integrate those into your one that you do have dominion over, which is why Mufasa, as the apex predator in The Lion King, has Zazu, the cosmic eye, flying over him so he can keep tabs and keep watch over the other kingdoms and what's going on. And then Mufasa can, in live time, update his own hierarchy such that it doesn't become stale. So for it to feel constantly vivified, you just can't stay still for 1 second. Otherwise, entropy. Entropy is a ever-present danger and reality.
And I'm curious about, where does the love come in? And even, like, where does the love in Plato and Aristotle come in? Because it comes in such a big way in Christianity and has informed so much of kind of Western development and the values we hold, but it's not obvious, to trace that. But even in this way of that, almost like the mental is what can have that form of intelligence, and at that propositional layer is really fitted to it. But as it becomes more of an embodied task and a relational task, where as we are as people always situated within a social context, there's almost like navigating that social hierarchy of being with the engineers, you know, and their adeptness for mind patterns, but being with the laborers and their strength and craftsmanship and experience, like how do you harmonize and synthesize and find reconciliation with that situation? And it seems that it then, yeah, maybe like the mentor is the transcendence up the hierarchy, but it's the love and that pervades as you come back down the hierarchy. And that's why it's almost like the glory of going back down is because it radiates from your heart, and it's something that you find, like as Zarathustra coming back down the mountain was, you know, almost really from that heart space of devout passion to go back to his fellow people and share it with them. And he kind of gets made a fool in doing that because he's too foolhardy in some sense, which also brings in like, yeah, the golden mean, where although you can develop and have that capacity for love that's required for you to take your understanding back out to people and back into the social hierarchy, it it is then conditioned by that interaction, which helps you to find like the proper fittedness in that. And it can't just be its excess, it has to be its right relation, its ratio religio, which is wisdom. Knowledge and understanding will get you ascend and see through and overcome your own self-deception. But what then helps you to become compassionate and giving and able to give up things for others and self-sacrifice in that way? This is the essence of what I think is lacking in Aristotle. He doesn't have the ethic and empathic core that is inscribed in our heart.
Couldn't agree more. I think there's a dryness to him that takes you very far, but only ultimately so far, and a serious lack and absence of the psychosomatic melding that is necessary for the completion, the apotheosis of the ascent. It's worth noting that the last final stage of the hero's journey laid out by Joseph Campbell is always the philanthropic move. And it's never felt as to be an act of self-sacrifice. I know you use that word poetically, but it's the hero is not giving up a part of his ego to help the villagers by giving them the pot of gold. He's helping himself. And it harkens back to something I always say, which is there is no selfless good deed. The hero is genuinely consecrating and augmenting his own reality by lifting those around him. And it's the tide that lifts all boats at the culmination of the hero's journey. And there's a serious lack in that general state in Aristotle. You know, he's just kind of, yeah, he's approaching things, he's getting kind of far, but yeah, man, there's a felt sense of that loss. And you don't have so much of that in Plato. You know, when in the Symposium, when you asked earlier about where does love fit in, I almost feel like Aristotle would run away if you asked him that question. And it's not like he doesn't have an answer. He'll give you an answer, but he just knows himself it's inadequate were he pressed on it, you know. But something just as a sort of a umbrella thing, a lot of Greek philosophers do kind of talk about love in the same terms that they speak of desire, and desire in a wider way in terms of eros, right? And like in the Symposium, and the object of your obsession and fascination should almost invertedly tell you what you love. So don't worry about sitting down and thinking about it. Just where does your act of devotion lie? To whom do your allegiances lie? And that's almost like somehow a backwards answer to love. But even that feels so cheap. And it's, again, not a portrayal accurate to what is inscribed in our hearts. So that's something that I think we're not going to get in the metaphysics when talking about engineers and laborers. There's a huge privileging of the nomos at the cost of narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, there was something great which you helped to kind of really stir up there, and I'm going to do my best to riff on it, and it connects a few different it connects something that I had wanted to say right at the start of this. I've got it, written on the page right at the top,
Yeah.
and now is the time potentially to weave it in. It brings back that, and it makes me question, where was Aristotle's love? Like, what did he love? What was moving him and, yeah, guiding him through? Because he placed such a strong emphasis on the mind, and Plato placed such a strong emphasis on the good. But it's like they didn't have that idea that the logos was innately bound and wound up to love, and to the particular kind of, not philia, not agape, to agapic love. They didn't have that primal role of it in culture yet. It's not only that they hadn't thought it yet, but they hadn't felt it yet.
Hmm.
But Aristotle does have such a passion for the mind, and for the mind as a naturally occurring reality that we participate in, that we as humans, as distinct from other animals, have this ability to receive it, and in contemplation get closer to it. So that was almost the anagogic ascent, but it wasn't an ascent that deepened love, and it was an ascent that deepened knowledge and clarity. And like, what would Aristotle say about love? He'd write a book on it. He would have volumes to say on it. But where does that get us? And when we look at, his, obsession and fascination with vision and the eye as this primary sense that determined kind of mental activity and was its best fitted metaphor, Jean Gebser has thought about the structure of Western consciousness and the movement through different philosophers, and he says that through Plato and Aristotle we get this emergence, and yeah, we get this activity of the mental, from the mythic structure to the mental structure, and it's symbolized through the organ of the eye. And the eye has the ability to focus on certain things, to fixate, and to kind of blur out everything else in your attention. And like, it's also to sort of unworld it from the context that it otherwise exists within. And for Heidegger, that's that term, Heideggerian term, to unworld something is to, yeah, kind of collapse it from its meaningful inhabitants of the background and its significance in the world at large. And in that way, like, it's yeah, that rationality that comes in, that segments and cuts up and analyzes, and doesn't have that center of compassion that can maybe see, yeah, that emotional landscape that things participate in. And like Aristotle, of course, in that book, in that book on love would have the house of being in there, but it would also have the slaughterhouse of being. Like, how much is it then removed and extracted and dissected knowledge and understanding and wisdom from where wisdom is, and the context that wisdom is found in, and the context that, yeah. And so that's it. That's where I can leave the floor feeling like I've been able to articulate my own account of my own, like, yeah, reception of Aristotle, part one.
Yeah, I think that's a good closing off point too, is where his limitations lie and where we feel like he's genuinely making a positive contribution, but it's just incomplete. And, it's a great hypothetical experiment as well, just to envision what Aristotle would write in this book of love, because he would absolutely, if there's a topic to write about, he would write about it, and I get the sense that I would read it and I'd get value from it, knowing full well that it's not wrong, but it's incomplete. It's like the manosphere guys. I don't really disagree with you, but that can't be your picture of reality, you know? That would be my take on Aristotle's take on love. But yeah, I don't really have too much else to say on these opening few chapters in Alpha. So did you have any closing thoughts?
I'm pretty happy to end it there. There's gonna be a lot, a lot that comes from checking in on this again and giving it a break and returning to this material, and looking forward to just taking the time to listen to it, because there's so much in my experience of listening to our last conversation and what you're saying, Luca, is just how dense and how packed and how wonderfully intelligible the communication is, but that I could never, and in the podcast, I never am able to hear it all in the first pass. So listening to it again and absorbing the richness that's there will be its own practice that I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to the ensuing thoughts and musings that I'm going to have from this conversation for the next few days, and consulting the daemon in regard to that. But in terms of what's said of Aristotle and his treatment of early philosophers and the character of wisdom that he sets out and the limitations that we find in him, I think we've done our justice to it.
Absolutely. And I think he
Just
is
us.
very much, yeah, just us. Yeah, I mean, part of what makes your salience landscape highly altered from one listen to another is whether you're running or not, right? So just listen to this back once, on an empty stomach, once with too many carbs, once being underslept, and just keep changing one variable and you'll hear a different conversation every time.
Yeah, and then you'll get the physiology of this conversation.
Yeah. But yeah, so for those that watched all the way till here, yeah, appreciate your time, and I hope you appreciate ours. You must do, because you made it till here. Make sure to subscribe, do your thing. And this was part 2, or conversation 2, in a lengthy series we'll be doing on Aristotle's metaphysics, taking it part by part, taking it kind of flowy, kind of structured. So if you enjoy the, bros by the campfire conversing about old dead guy thing, you must do, because you made it this far. So I don't need to say all this now, because yeah, you're clearly here and along for the ride with me, Alex, and Aristotle. So yeah, thank you. And it was a pleasure, my friend.
Namaste.